Hey everyone, CVH here with Between the Lanes with a deck tech today. As you can see on screen, today we'll be going over the Goblin Scout deck. This is a build I've been playing a little bit recently on stream. You might have seen the gameplay video I just posted before this with a few games from Legend Ladder with the deck. The original build was given to me by Harrison5371, whose name you might remember from an article he wrote on Between the Lanes pretty recently. Check that out if you haven't. There are some differences. I changed, I think, 3 cards exactly from the initial build he gave me. But this is a bit of an unusual deck, right? Because while it is, at its core, a midrange deck, you don't really see the Goblin package too much in constructed play, and I think he did a really good job of incorporating it into the strategy, so I decided, after having a relatively high success rate with the deck at Legend, to just do a deck tech of it, because it's a deck you probably haven't really seen before, so I thought I might as well give my thoughts on the card choices, even though I didn't initially build the deck, so maybe you could try it out for yourselves and change things as well. So without further ado, let's go through the list as we usually do. Murkwater Goblin, pretty standard Goblin support card. If you've seen Goblin decks before, they're probably running this card. I can't really talk about it without talking about Goblin Skulk. You run one because of the other, vice versa. 2-drop 2/2, Pilfer's Draw, a Murkwater Goblin from your deck. Goblin by itself, very subpar. When we're looking at this card, we kind of think of Enraged Mudcrab, except if Mudcrab didn't have an attack value on your opponent's turn, and that's pretty crucial, because when your opponent's trading into the Mudcrab with a 2/2 or a 3/2, all of a sudden their guy doesn't die. Really hard to take favorable trades on your opponent's turn. Luckily, this card does cost 0, so you can literally weave it into any turn. It just kind of feels bad when you're floating Magicka and playing a Murkwater Goblin, but it does the job of pushing some damage early, and it is an important card for some of the other Goblin support cards we'll talk about in a little bit. Next, we get to some staples in Agility. In my opinion, don't really need to harp on these too much. You see them in almost every Agility deck I post and the other people post. And Ungolem the Listener, because it's fantastic. 3 Daring Cutpurse, not a Goblin, but pretty premium 2-drop, and actually premium as well. And 3 Fighters Guild Recruit. So this is actually the change I made in the list. I consider this card nearly a staple in all Agility decks, whether they be ramp, midrange, or aggro. Of course, this deck falls on the midrange side of things. But Fighters Guild Recruit, I took out 1 copy of Dune Stalker for the card. I'll bring that up right here. 1 copy of Dune Stalker I took out for the card. Didn't really feel like it was too necessary in the build. We already have the 3 Dune Smugglers for movement, and no other really way to take advantage of that. It's a fine card, but I felt like Fighters Guild had more priority, and for the same reason I took out the 3rd copies of both Young Mammoth and the Leaf Lurker. A Leaf Lurker, obviously a fantastic removal, but we already have a bit of silence in the deck, and I felt like without ways to activate it outside of Murkwater, which no real procs for the Leaf Lurker, would feel a little bit clunky in my hand, and Young Mammoth obviously is a fantastic 3-drop, but I needed 1 more card to cut for the Fighters Guild Recruit, and our 3-drop slot seemed a little bit high, as opposed to our 2-drop slot, so that's where that happened. As far as this card goes, I think it's fantastic in this build. As you might notice already, we are extremely weak on the Prophecy count. That's not really the reason I'm including it, because 3 versus 6 Prophecies, not a huge difference. You still can't really count on them in your runes when you're getting broken by an aggro player or another midrange deck. But this card is one of the most important cards at making sure you can stay ahead on life early when you're up against one of those other midrange decks that also cares about it. If they drop a Mournhold Trader, what can you really do to that card except for Fighters Guild Recruit? Obviously, your game plan is to be getting aggressive in the start of the game, but it's better to have this card on 2 than nothing on 2 by a pretty wide margin, and this is even the preferred 2-drop when your opponent plays their 2-drop first and it's a Mournhold Trader or something similar. Not all the time you want to race that card with the Windkeep Spellsword, etc. So, Fighters Guild Recruit I think is fantastic. Goblin Skulk we already talked about because of the Goblin. These are both Goblins, and we're playing a Goblin deck. Pretty decent package right there. Murkwater Witch, as fantastic as ever, is our only proc for Leaf Lurker, and is a Goblin itself. This is something I guess people might overlook, because this card is actually something that sees constructed play in, again, almost every Agility deck, from Midrange Archer to Ramp Scout. Windkeep Spellsword, not a whole lot of Endurance in the deck, mostly a green deck, but we do use the Endurance in this deck to sort of round out the curve, and this is one of the best 2-drops in the game, so we have access to it. It's pretty fantastic to counter opposing Fighters Guild Recruits, take favorable trades, and dropping it down late in the game can protect your board against Ice Storm, Burn, and Pillage. This card just doesn't die to those cards, straight up. 3 Dune Smuggler, this is the only movement, as I mentioned, because we cut the Dune Stalker. Just a generally good 3-drop. We're trying to focus on the green in this deck for our Nimble Ally, and this keeps your Goblins out of the way. Using it in conjunction with Goblin Skulk when they try to contest the Skulk with either a thing that can trade into it or a guard. Very important. This deck really wants to be able to push damage consistently early, as I'll talk about when we get to our 5-drop slot. And this card helps you do that, and can also dictate some trades. It's a really hard card to play around these movement between the lanes cards. As I mentioned, we want to stay ahead on life, and basically, as always, as it has been, is, and will always be, House Kinsman is pretty central to that plan. Very important to get ahead on life. The heal can be very relevant when you're up against those even faster aggro decks, because we're, like I said, very weak on prophecies, don't have Moonlight, Werebat, anything of the sort. So Murkwater Butcher I could actually talk about as a 1-drop, but, you know, let's be realistic, a lot of the time it's not a 1-drop, a lot of the time it's a very poorly statted 3-drop. However, we do run this card, it's a Goblin, and it's one of the things you can mulligan for. When it's a 1-drop, it's just fantastic. It's important to note, if Murkwater Butcher's in your hand during your first turn, reduce its cost to 1, that effect stays. So even though if you want to play Ungolem first, or if you want to Elixir a 2-drop first, and then play Double Butcher, that was reduced on turn, whatever you want to do, basically the first copy is going to be reduced if it's in your hand on turn 1. You don't necessarily have to commit to playing it turn 1, it doesn't limit you in that way. When you draw it later in the game, it's a little weak, but a lot of the things in this deck, when you draw them later in the game, are pretty weak, such as, you know, your Murkwater Goblins and your Skulks. This deck isn't really designed to go late in the first place. So yeah, when I say it's a mid-range deck, it really doesn't function too differently from Midrange Archer or even the other mid-range Scout decks you might see. It's just sort of the unusual Goblin package. And, you know, you're really trying to just curve out on your opponent, get some neat effects, and basically finish your control deck opponents off with your insane 5-drops that we'll get to in a second, while having the Goblin synergy. And that does give this deck a slightly lower curve than the other mid-range Scout decks you might see, which are using cards like the new Mimic, Illusory Mimic from the Madhouse collection. So this deck sort of has a lower curve than those. 3 Nimble Allies, because like I said, we're very, very heavy on the agility in the deck, even slightly heavier than in Harrison's build because I took out the 3rd Young Mammoth. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 whiffs in the deck for the Nimble Ally. Still occasionally happens, but when it hits, 4 out of 5 times, 80%, that's a really fantastic card. Just basically a Mammoth with lethal, so can't really complain there, except, you know, it could get silenced, a little bit weaker to silence, but fantastic card since we're mostly green because of the Goblins. Young Mammoth, fantastic 3, I've talked about this card a lot, not really much to say. Would run 3 if I had to play 51 cards, probably. 3 Murkwater Skirmisher. So this is really the Goblin synergy card of the deck. 4-drop 4/4 is really nothing fantastic by itself, although there are definitely worse cards stat-wise. If you get 1 buff out of this card, you're essentially playing 6/6 of stats for 4 Magicka, and 2/2 of those stats that's going on the other Goblin that's already on the board probably gets to get its value immediately via trading or whatever. If you're playing a Butcher on 3, obviously that's not really what we want to be doing, but just for the sake of this example, if you're playing this on 3, following it up with the Skirmisher on 4, the 2/2 that you're giving to the Butcher has immediate value because the Butcher can all of a sudden attack that turn. And even with the Goblins, when you have these cards in your hand, if you happen to, you know, you have a Goblin Skulk on the board, you top deck a Skirmisher, you can get this Goblin on turn 4, for example, and immediately, because it costs 0, you can play the Goblin to the board, play the Skirmisher, get double buff. It's a pretty huge amount of buffs sometimes with this deck that you can wind up getting, if that's the goal, if you really need some buffs against cards like Ice Storm, if your opponent's threatening to counter trade, Burn and Pillage, whatever it may be. So yeah, Skirmisher, pretty powerful card if you can support it, and obviously I think this card only gets better as more Goblins get released in future expansions, you know, a long ways down the line. So yeah, that's basically the core part of the package of Goblins right there. And now we move on to the 5-drop slot. I want to talk about the Black Robe Necromancer and Soulrest Marshal together. Obviously this is a core part of the normal Mimic Scout midrange, basically, just Scout midrange. And these cards are just a core part of their own midrange decks. Midrange is very powerful on the ladder right now. You see decks like the Sorcerer deck that I've played curve out into Black Robe Necromancer and Royal Sage. Midrange Archer, as usual, curves out into Soulrest Marshal and Triumphant Jarl. And all the Scout midrange decks curve out into both of these. So this is really how the deck wants to be. Decks like Ramp Scout, decks like Control Mage, Control Spellsword, whatever. While this deck suffers, as most midrange decks do, a little bit against aggro, the lower curve helps out somewhat. And, of course, these cards are just incredibly powerful against slower decks. So, Soulrest Marshal, a little bit worse than Necromancer sometimes in this deck. It is really hard to refill your hand in this deck. It's almost impossible since we really don't have any cycling in the deck. There's no Triumphant Jarls or anything. So on turn 5, this card is great. Afterwards, kind of subpar. However, Necromancer does come into play and help us cycle or help us recycle, I guess, which is another way of getting, some value onto the board without necessarily having to have a hand. This card is pretty important because you can run out of a hand pretty quickly if you're accomplishing your game plan, and Necromancer can sort of fill the Jarl's role of giving you value, except the value goes straight to the board, except into your hand. Basically just giving you some steam late game when you're threatening to run out. So besides that, already talked about Leaf Lurker, good removal. Shadowfen Priest, fantastic silence. There's only 2 of them in the deck, but I haven't really felt like I needed more. It's also worth noting that our 4-drop slot's a little weak. I don't think it would be the worst to experiment with running Cursed Spectres over the 2 Shadowfen Priests. Just something to consider going forward, just to lower the curve slightly. Depends on how prevalent supports are, how much you need that effect. But this does also increase the prophecy count to 8, a little bit better than 6. Something to think about there. Haven't tested this in this build yet, so I can't really say for certain which is better, and in my Sorcerer deck I ran them both, so I don't know if taking out Shadowfen Priest is right, but if the curve is becoming a problem after a lot more testing, that's something to think about. Cliff Racer in a lot of these mid-range decks just because it's a fantastic card. It gives you some reach late in the game, which this deck doesn't have a ton of. Having that extra 4 damage that you could potentially top deck can allow you to play in a certain way, and that's very important. It's also just a good card to help you trade if you need to. So I already talked about all the other 5 drops, and all of a sudden the curve just straight up jumps to 9. With Tazcad, the Packmaster, this is just sort of that late game sort of oomph in case you need to just finish your opponent off. It is a Goblin, which is almost entirely irrelevant because if Tazcad's hitting the board, you're probably not going to be buffing it with the Skirmish, or you're probably just going to be killing your opponent. I haven't found, I haven't found any situation where this gets buffed, but it's a good enough card, I think, to warrant the slot. However, if you're trying to lower the curve, you might want to put in some other form of extra damage or whatever. Because we don't even have the Thieves Guild Recruit in the deck to lower the cost. But there were definitely games when I was just looking for that extra bit of damage, and it did wind up winning me the game. So yeah, I would test the build as is first, and there are definitely some things to do in the future. Hopefully you enjoyed it. It's a pretty unique deck. Thanks to Harrison for the initial list. If you want to check out some gameplay of the deck, feel free to look at the gameplay video I just posted, which you should be seeing on screen right about now, on your screen to click on. As always, be sure to drop a subscription to the channel if you want to see more strategy content, as well as other deck techs. Check out Between the Lanes, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.